On the morning of July 22, 2003, in a quiet residential neighborhood of Mosul, Iraq, the most expensive betrayal in modern military history reached its violent conclusion. Inside a modest villa on the banks of the Tigris River, two of the most wanted men in the world were about to face an overwhelming force armed with anti-tank missiles designed to destroy Soviet battle tanks. By nightfall, $30 million would change hands, 4 bodies would be pulled from the rubble, and the myth of Saddam Hussein's invincible dynasty would shatter forever. This is the story of Operation Red Dawn's opening act, a 6-hour siege that transformed from a capture mission into something far more lethal, and the questions it raised about proportionality, necessity, and the price of justice in warfare. March 20, 2003. Coalition forces storm across the Kuwaiti border into Iraq with a mission that would define a generation of American military intervention. Shock and awe rains down on Baghdad as precision strikes obliterate key government buildings, communications nodes, and military installations. Within 3 weeks, Saddam Hussein's regime collapses. Statues topple in city squares. Looters ransack government buildings. American tanks roll through streets lined with cheering crowds and burning portraits. President George W. Bush declares major combat operations complete on the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln beneath a banner reading mission accomplished. But the most dangerous men in Iraq have simply vanished. Uday and Qusay Hussein were not ordinary regime officials. These were not bureaucrats or party functionaries who might blend quietly into civilian life. The elder brother Uday had run the Iraqi Olympic Committee, where athletes who disappointed him were allegedly subjected to torture and imprisonment. He owned newspapers and television stations that served as propaganda arms of the regime. Witnesses described a man of staggering cruelty and unpredictability, someone who could kill on impulse and without consequence. His younger brother Qusay controlled the Republican Guard and Special Republican Guard, the military units most loyal to the regime and most capable of organized resistance. Intelligence analysts viewed him as the operational brain behind potential insurgent operations. Together, they represented both the institutional memory and the violent capability to sustain guerrilla warfare indefinitely. After the regime collapsed, these brothers became the 2 highest value targets on the coalition's most wanted list. 55 names arranged on a deck of playing cards distributed to soldiers throughout Iraq. Uday was the ace of hearts. Qusay was the ace of clubs. Only their father outranked them. Each brother carried a $15 million bounty on his head, the highest rewards offered by the United States government for information leading to their capture. For context, Osama bin Laden's bounty at that time was $25 million. The Hussein brothers together were worth more than the world's most wanted terrorist. The spring of 2003 transformed into a long, hot summer. American troops fanned out across Iraq searching for regime remnants. Intelligence poured in, most of it useless. Informants claimed sightings in Baghdad, Tikrit, Ramadi, the Syrian border. Special operations teams chased leads through dusty villages and urban neighborhoods. Raids turned up documents, weapons caches, mid-level Ba'athist officials, but never the high-value targets. Meanwhile, attacks on coalition forces increased. Improvised explosive devices appeared along convoy routes. Small arms fire rattled through checkpoints. Americans began dying in ones and twos in a conflict that was supposed to be over. Military leadership needed a victory to demonstrate that the former regime was truly finished. That resistance was futile. That cooperation with coalition forces would be rewarded. They needed the brothers. Mosul lies 350 miles north of Baghdad, Iraq's second-largest city, ancient Nineveh, a sprawling urban center along the Tigris River where Arab, Kurdish, Turkmen, and Christian communities had coexisted for millennia under increasingly authoritarian Ba'athist rule. After the invasion, it became a puzzle for occupation forces. Not as violently chaotic as Baghdad or the Sunni Triangle, but not as stable as the Kurdish north. Enough residual Ba'athist support to provide cover for fugitives. Enough tribal networks to hide them. Enough money flowing through historic smuggling routes to sustain them indefinitely. The perfect place for Saddam's sons to disappear while planning their next move. Nawaf al-Zaydan was a businessman with property holdings in the Al-Fala neighborhood of western Mosul. He owned the kind of large family villa common among successful merchants in the city, multi-story construction behind high walls with a garden courtyard. These homes were designed for extended families, with separate living spaces for sons and their wives, guest quarters for visiting relatives, enough rooms that strangers coming and going would attract little attention from neighbors. In mid-July 2003, al-Zaydin began hosting very important guests who paid generously for absolute discretion and total security. Exactly how American intelligence identified the villa remains partially classified. What we know is this. On July 21st, a human intelligence source contacted coalition forces with specific information about the location of Uday and Qusay Hussein. The source provided the address, described the building layout, indicated that the brothers were accompanied by at least one bodyguard and possibly Qusay's 14-year-old son Mustafa. The intelligence was graded as highly credible, significant enough to mobilize immediate action. Task Force 20, a joint special operations command element hunting high-value targets throughout Iraq, began mission planning within hours. The decision calculus was straightforward, but loaded with risk. If the intelligence was accurate, this represented the best opportunity in 4 months to eliminate or capture the regime's second and third most wanted individuals. If it was wrong, if this was deliberate misinformation or a case of mistaken identity, American soldiers might assault an innocent Iraqi family's home with overwhelming force, creating a propaganda disaster and possibly civilian casualties. The intelligence had to be verified, and the operation had to be executed with enough power to prevent escape, but enough restraint to allow surrender if offered. That balancing act would prove impossible. July 22, 2003 began like any summer morning in Mosul. Merchants opened their shops, children played in dusty streets, families prepared breakfast. In the Al-Fala neighborhood, nothing seemed unusual at the large villa owned by Nawaf al-Zaydin. But beneath that ordinary surface, extraordinary forces were converging. Task Force 20 operators moved into position. Soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division established an outer cordon. Helicopters lifted off from forward operating bases. Snipers took overwatch positions on rooftops. And inside the villa, 4 men had no idea their location had been compromised or that the largest price ever placed on Iraqi heads was about to be collected. At approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, United States forces completed their cordon around the villa. Multiple blocks in each direction were sealed. Civilians were moved away from the immediate area. Soldiers set up fighting positions with clear fields of fire toward the building. The outer perimeter was tight enough to prevent escape but distant enough to provide standoff in case of ambush. Then the bullhorn crackling. This is the United States Army. The building is surrounded. Everyone inside exit immediately with your hands raised. You will not be harmed if you comply. This is your only warning. Surrender now. Silence from the villa. Minutes passed. The announcement repeated in Arabic. Still nothing. Task Force 20 commanders faced their first decision point. Force entry or wait them out. The mission planning had anticipated non-compliance. These were not men who would walk out with hands up into American custody knowing they faced trial for war crimes, crimes against humanity, decades of brutality documented by international organizations. Intelligence assessed that both brothers would fight rather than surrender. They were reportedly armed, trained, and psychologically prepared to die rather than face capture. But military rules of engagement required offering the opportunity for peaceful surrender before initiating assault. That requirement had been met. Now came the hard part. Initial entry attempts began around mid-morning. Soldiers approached the building under covering fire. The plan was textbook close-quarters battle. Breach the doors, flood the building with overwhelming numbers, isolate and neutralize any resistance before occupants could organize a defense or destroy intelligence materials. But the moment the first teams reached the villa doors, the building erupted with gunfire. Automatic weapons fire poured from multiple windows. The accuracy was shocking. These were not panicked civilians firing wildly. These were trained shooters with good positions, good weapons, and clear intent to kill as many Americans as possible before going down. The entry teams took cover and returned fire, but the villa's construction proved formidable. Thick walls absorbed small arms fire. Windows provided protected firing positions. The building's design, meant to keep summer heat out and family privacy in, now served as an improvised fortress. The firefight intensified. Soldiers maneuvered for better positions. Snipers engaged targets visible through windows, but every approach to the building came under accurate defensive fire. One American soldier was wounded, then another. Task Force 20 had faced entrenched enemies before in Afghanistan and throughout Iraq, but this felt different. The volume and precision of fire from the villa suggested military training at the highest level, exactly what you would expect from a Republican Guard commander and the former head of Iraqi Special Operations. These were not insurgents with Kalashnikovs. This was a prepared defense by men who understood small unit tactics and were willing to use them. Commanders on scene reassessed. A prolonged firefight in a residential neighborhood risked civilian casualties. Any pause gave the occupants time to destroy documents or prepare more elaborate defenses. Waiting them out could take days and allow time for sympathetic locals to organize relief or diversion tactics. Most importantly, American soldiers were getting hit. The mission parameters began to shift. What started as a capture or kill operation with preference for capture was now tilting heavily toward kill. Not out of vengeance, but operational necessity. You cannot capture men who are determined to die fighting and possess the skills to take many attackers with them. The question became how to neutralize the threat with minimum risk to American lives. The call went up for air support. Within minutes, an OH-58 Kiowa helicopter gunship arrived on station. The Kiowa is a light reconnaissance and attack helicopter, nimble enough for urban operations, armed with everything from .50 caliber machine guns to rockets to missiles. Most importantly, it could deliver precision firepower from angles the ground troops could not safely access. The pilots made their first gun run, raking the upper floors of the villa with heavy machine gun fire. But the building continued to return fire. The Kiowas re-engaged, firing rockets into the structure. Explosions bloomed from the upper stories. Smoke began pouring from shattered windows. Still, the defenders kept shooting. This was the pattern interrupt that changed everything. A target that could absorb helicopter gunship attacks and continue fighting was no longer a barricaded suspect scenario. This was a hardened military position requiring escalation of force normally reserved for armored vehicles or fortified bunkers. The decision was made at a command level that remains partly classified, but the outcome was visible to every soldier on the perimeter. Bring in the TOW missiles. The BGM-71 TOW missile stands for tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided. It was designed during the Cold War to destroy Soviet tanks from distances up to 3 kilometers. The warhead carries over 6 kilograms of high explosive shaped to penetrate thick armor plating, then detonate inside the target. Its use against buildings is devastating. The missile punches through exterior walls and detonates inside, turning concrete into shrapnel and creating overpressure waves that collapse interior structures. It is unquestionably overkill against a residential building. It is also unquestionably effective. The first TOW missile streaked across the Al-Fala neighborhood with a roar like tearing metal. The explosion when it hit the villa was felt blocks away. A section of the upper story disintegrated. Debris showered the street. Smoke and dust obscured the building. Soldiers watched their fields of fire, waiting for survivors to emerge or return fire. Instead, more shots came from the wreckage. Incredibly, impossibly, the defenders were still in the fight. A second missile fired, then a third. Reports from soldiers on scene and subsequent military briefings indicate that up to 10 TOW missiles were fired into the villa over the course of the siege. By any standard, that is extraordinary. Each missile costs tens of thousands of dollars. Each represents massive destructive power. The fact that so many were required suggests either incredible structural resilience of the building, exceptional defensive preparation by the occupants, or command determination to leave absolutely nothing to chance. The siege ground on through late morning into afternoon. Mosul's summer heat baked soldiers in their body armor behind concrete barriers and sandbag positions. Inside the villa, 4 human beings were making their final stand. Uday Hussein, 39 years old, whose life of privilege and cruelty had brought him to this dusty death in a borrowed house. Qusay Hussein, 37, the quieter brother who ran the killing apparatus of the regime, now experiencing the terror his own security forces had inflicted on thousands. Mustafa Hussein, 14 years old, Qusay's eldest son, a child who never chose this life but was born into it and would die in it. And a bodyguard whose name has been lost to history but whose loyalty was absolute unto death. The decision to continue firing missiles into a building known to contain a 14-year-old boy would later generate intense ethical debate. Military briefers argued that Mustafa was armed and firing alongside the adults, making him a combatant under rules of engagement. Critics countered that a child in such circumstances has no meaningful choice, and that proportionality demands exhausting all alternatives before using anti-tank weapons in residential areas. The truth, uncomfortable and complex, is that modern counterinsurgency constantly generates these impossible scenarios where legal combatant status and moral culpability diverge. A 14-year-old shooting at soldiers is legally a combatant. He is also morally a victim. Both things can be true, war makes them collide. By early afternoon, the villa was a smoking ruin. Sections of roof had collapsed. Walls were punctured with gaping holes. Fires burned in multiple rooms. The shooting had finally stopped. Task Force 20 operators moved in cautiously, clearing room by room through rubble and smoke. They found the 4 bodies on an upper floor. All had died from a combination of blast trauma, shrapnel wounds, and structural collapse. The mansion's interior was unrecognizable. Weapons lay scattered among the debris: AK-47 rifles, pistols, spare magazines. A final defensive position that had held far longer than anyone expected. Now came the crucial task of identification. Capturing or killing high-value targets is meaningless without proof. Too many false reports had circulated. Too many times intelligence had been certain only to find low-level fighters or innocent civilians. The United States military needed absolute confirmation that these were indeed Saddam's sons before announcing victory. Initial identification came from documents found on the bodies and physical characteristics checked against intelligence files. But given the body's condition after hours of explosives and fire, forensic certainty required more. Dental records provided the definitive match. Both brothers had extensive dental work documented in files maintained by the regime. Forensic specialists compared the body's dental structures to archived records. The matches were conclusive. These were Uday and Qusay Hussein. Mustafa's identity was similarly confirmed. The 4th body was identified as a longtime Hussein family bodyguard. The Department of Defense faced an unusual choice about public disclosure. Normally, photographs of enemy dead are not released, both as a matter of dignity and to avoid creating martyr imagery. But Iraq remained skeptical of coalition claims. Many Iraqis assumed that regime figures had escaped to Syria or were hiding with tribal protection. Rumors constantly circulated that coalition kill or capture claims were propaganda. If the United States claimed that Uday and Qusay were dead, but provided no evidence, the brothers could become ghosts around which resistance could rally. The decision was made at the highest levels to release post-mortem photographs with a viewer discretion warning and clear explanation that this was exceptional disclosure required by operational necessity. The images released by the Department of Defense showed both brothers' faces cleaned and positioned for identification purposes. They were clinical photographs, not trophy shots, presented alongside dental records and physical identifiers. Nevertheless, they were deeply disturbing to view. These were human beings whose facial features were partially destroyed, displayed for global media consumption. The images circulated worldwide within hours, broadcast on Arab satellite networks, printed in newspapers, posted on early internet forums. For many Iraqis, seeing the bodies was the first moment they truly believed the regime had fallen. The psychological impact was immeasurable. Nawaf al-Zaydan, the villa owner who provided the intelligence, collected his $30 million reward and disappeared into witness protection. Reports suggest he relocated outside Iraq under a new identity, his life purchased at the cost of 4 others and his homeland behind him forever. $30 million is generational wealth, enough to live comfortably anywhere in the world and provide for children and grandchildren. But it is also blood money that must weigh differently in the quiet hours. Did he believe he was helping to end a brutal regime and save Iraqi lives by removing its most violent enforcers? Or was it simple mercenary calculation, extraordinary wealth offered for information he happened to possess? The historical record provides no interviews, no statements of motivation. He gave them up and vanished, a ghost at the center of the story. The military and strategic consequences played out quickly. Within days of the confirmed deaths, intelligence reports indicated increased cooperation from Iraqi civilians. More tips about weapons caches came in. More information about remaining Ba'athist networks arrived. The destruction of the villa and the overwhelming force used sent an unmistakable message. The coalition would spend any amount of money, fire any weapon, destroy any building to eliminate regime targets. There would be no safe houses, no protection sufficient to withstand American determination. For former regime officials still at large, the calculus changed. Surrender became more attractive. Hiding became more terrifying. The broader impact on Ba'athist resistance is harder to quantify but atmospherically significant. Saddam's entire rule rested on a mythology of invincibility, of the strong man who could not be defeated, whose family was untouchable, whose power was absolute. The fall of Baghdad had cracked that myth. The deaths of his sons shattered it completely. If Uday and Qusay could be hunted down and killed despite their resources, training, and loyal networks, what chance did lesser figures have? The dynastic succession that Saddam had carefully constructed was eliminated. Qusay had been groomed as heir apparent. Mustafa was the next generation. With them dead, the regime became a historical artifact rather than a continuing threat. Even if Saddam himself remained at large, he was now a fugitive leader of nothing, a king without a kingdom or heirs. This brings us directly to the central controversy. Was the Mosul raid a necessary tactical escalation to eliminate a uniquely dangerous threat? Or did it cross the line from capture mission into an ethically fraught kill operation? The answer requires examining both the tactical realities and the broader moral framework. From a purely tactical perspective, the escalation was arguably justified. American forces did what law of armed conflict requires. They identified the target, established a cordon, demanded surrender, and only used force when met with armed resistance. The defenders fired first. They fired with military precision. They wounded American soldiers. They continued firing even after helicopter gunships engaged. At what point does the attacking force's obligation to minimize harm to defenders yield to the obligation to protect its own soldiers? Every military in history answers that when defenders refuse surrender and inflict casualties, attackers may use whatever force is necessary to eliminate the threat. By that standard, using TOW missiles was simply employing the most effective means to end resistance and protect American lives. But effectiveness is not the same as proportionality. International humanitarian law requires that military force be proportionate to the threat and the military advantage sought. Were 10 anti-tank missiles proportionate to eliminating 4 barricaded individuals? Could the building have been surrounded and held until thirst or exhaustion forced surrender? The defenders were not going anywhere. The cordon was tight. Time was on the coalition's side. The counter-argument is that every hour of waiting is an hour for booby traps to be set, for relief forces to organize, for civilian shields to be gathered, for international media to arrive and complicate the situation. Moreover, every hour is an hour that American soldiers remain in danger. Proportionality must account for risk to attackers, not only harm to defenders. The presence of 14-year-old Mustafa complicates the calculus immensely. If he was armed and firing, does his age matter tactically? Soldiers in the moment face incoming fire from a position. They have seconds to decide whether to return fire. Asking them to verify the age of every shooter before engaging is operationally impossible and morally unfair to the soldiers. But commanders planning the operation knew, or should have known, that Qusay's son was likely present. That knowledge should have weighted decision-making toward methods that maximized opportunity for surrender. Did 4 hours of siege provide adequate time, or should it have been 4 days? Then there is the broader question of whether this was ever truly a capture operation, or whether it was designed from the start as an execution. Did Task Force 20 arrive intending to take prisoners if possible, or was the machine already set to kill mode before the first bullhorn announcement? We cannot read the minds of commanders or the classified operation orders. We can observe that the speed of escalation from small arms to helicopters to missiles suggests a continuum of force prepared and authorized in advance. This is not necessarily improper. Intelligent planning accounts for resistance levels and prepares appropriate responses. But it does indicate that capture was probably a secondary objective once resistance began. The primary objective was elimination. Some observers see the Mosul raid as emblematic of post-9/11 American warfare, overwhelming technological force applied with insufficient concern for proportionality or the propaganda consequences of excessive destruction. The images of a luxury villa reduced to smoking rubble by missiles designed to kill tanks became iconic in the broader narrative of American military excess. Others see it as a textbook high-value target operation, intelligence-driven, precisely executed, with maximum enemy casualties and minimum friendly losses. Both interpretations contain truth. What changed after Mosul was the clear demonstration that bounty programs work. $30 million is life-changing money in one of the poorest regions of the world. It is enough to overcome tribal loyalty, family obligation, and fear of retaliation. After Uday and Qusay's deaths, the flow of intelligence about other high-value targets increased markedly. The same approach would eventually lead to Saddam Hussein himself, captured in December 2003 on a farm near Tikrit after yet another informant provided his location. The Rewards for Justice program became a cornerstone of American counterterrorism and counterinsurgency strategy. It is also darkly effective, turning communities into surveillance networks and neighbors into potential informants. Whether this serves long-term stability or simply purchases short-term tactical victories while corroding social trust is still debated. 5 months after the Mosul siege, American soldiers pulled a disheveled Saddam Hussein from a spider hole in the ground near his hometown. He was arraigned before an Iraqi tribunal, tried for crimes against humanity, and executed by hanging in December 2006. His last words were defiant. He faced death as he had lived, convinced of his righteousness and unrepentant. His sons never had that final moment. They died in a storm of explosives, knowing the world they had ruled was gone and taking whatever final thoughts they had into silence. The villa in Mosul was eventually demolished. The neighborhood rebuilt. Life continued in a city that has seen empires rise and fall for 5,000 years. The Al-Fala district today shows no trace of the battle that occurred there. This is perhaps fitting. War's physical scars heal faster than its moral ones. What do we take from the Mosul raid 20 years later? First, that high-value target operations are extraordinarily difficult to execute with the competing demands of force protection, proportionality, and certainty of identification. Task Force 20 faced an almost impossible tactical problem. Eliminate trained, determined defenders from a fortified position with minimum casualties, and solved it the only way they could, with overwhelming firepower. The ethical questions about proportionality remain valid even if the tactical decisions were sound. Second, that bounty programs, however effective, have profound consequences for social fabric and rule of law. $30 million is enough to make nearly anyone an informant. Do we want societies where loyalty to neighbors is constantly weighed against financial rewards from foreign powers? Does this create stable peace or simply efficient betrayal? The question matters far beyond Iraq. Third, that modern warfare and media interact in ways that make every tactical decision a strategic communication challenge. The Department of Defense chose to release post-mortem photographs for operational reasons, to prove the brothers were dead and demoralize remaining resistance. Those same images became recruiting tools for anti-American insurgents who pointed to the destroyed villa and the displayed bodies as evidence of occupation brutality. Both uses of the images were predictable. Both occurred. Managing that duality is the permanent condition of 21st century conflict. Fourth, that proportionality is not a purely legal question but a moral and strategic one. Using 10 anti-tank missiles to kill 4 people is legally defensible if they are combatants who refuse surrender and present a threat. But is it wise? Does it win the war or merely the battle? Does it make future enemies more likely to surrender or more determined to fight to the death knowing that capture attempts quickly become kill operations? These questions have no clean answers, only difficult tensions that commanders must navigate in real time. And finally, that children in war zones are both uniquely vulnerable and uniquely dangerous. Mustafa Hussein was 14, old enough to hold a rifle and fire it, young enough that his choices were shaped entirely by the family and culture he was born into. He likely believed he was defending his father and family honor. He also likely terrified the American soldiers firing back at him. His death was tragic and largely unavoidable once the siege began, but it was not inevitable. No child is born into a firefight against foreign soldiers. They are brought there by the decisions of adults who use them as shields and soldiers. Any accounting of the Mosul raid must include the question of how to protect children from the wars their parents start while also protecting soldiers from the weapons those children carry. So was the Mosul raid a necessary tactical escalation or an ethically fraught kill operation? The answer is that it was both, inseparably. Necessary because the brothers would not surrender, and any attempt to take them alive would have cost more American casualties. Ethically fraught because the level of force used against a building known to contain a child, and the speed of escalation from capture to kill raise profound questions about proportionality, and the value we place on enemy lives versus friendly lives. Both things are true. The raid was tactically successful and strategically valuable and morally complex. It eliminated two of the most dangerous men in Iraq and raised questions about how we wage war that persist to this day. In the history of special operations, the Mosul raid stands as a case study in the tensions between mission accomplishment and ethical restraint. It is taught in military schools as an example of high-value target operations and information-driven warfare. It is also analyzed in ethics courses as a boundary case for proportionality. We do not have the luxury of simple answers. What we have is the obligation to ask hard questions about the weapons we use, the force we apply, and the values we defend even in the midst of defending them. The broken villa in Mosul and the $30 million betrayal that led soldiers there will remain contested ground in the moral landscape of modern warfare. But this much is not contested. On July 22, 2003, Saddam Hussein's dynasty ended not in a palace or a courtroom, but in a hail of anti-tank missiles in a residential neighborhood. 4 people died. $30 million changed hands. And the message was sent to every regime figure still hiding. There is no sanctuary. There is no safety. There is only the choice to surrender or to wait for the missiles.